War and Peace by Leo Tolstoy. Translated by Alma and Louise Malle. Book 10. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Andy Yu. War and Peace by Leo Tolstoy. Book 10, Chapter 4. Bald Hills. Prince Nicholas Bolkonsky's estate lay 40 miles east from Smolensk and 2 miles from the main road to Moscow. The same evening that the prince gave his instructions to Alpátych, Dessalles, having asked to see Princess Mary, told her that as the prince was not very well and was taking no steps to secure his safety, though from Prince Andrew's letter it was evident that to remain at Bald Hill might be dangerous, he respectfully advised her to send a letter by Alpátych to the provincial governor at Smolensk, asking him to let her know the state of affairs and the extent of the danger to which Bald Hills was exposed. Dessalles wrote this letter to the governor for Princess Mary. She signed it, and it was given to Alpátych with instructions to hand it to the governor and to come back as quickly as possible if there was danger. Having received all his orders, Alpátych, wearing a white beaver hat, a present from the prince, and carrying a stick as the prince did, went out accompanied by his family. 3 well-fed rooms stood ready harnessed to a small conveyance with a leather hood. The larger bell was muffled and the little bells on the harness stuffed with paper. The prince allowed no one at Bald Hills to drive with ringing bells, but on a long journey Alpátych liked to have them. His satellites, the senior clerk, a counting-house clerk, a scullery maid, a cook, 2 old women, a little page-boy, the coachman, and various domestic serfs were seeing him off. His daughter placed chintz-covered down cushions for him to sit on and behind his back. His old sister-in-law popped in a small bundle, and one of the coachmen helped him into the vehicle. "There, there! Women's fuss! Women!" said Alpátych, putting and squeaking rapidly just as the prince did, and he climbed into the trap. After giving the clerk orders about the work to be done, Alpátych, not trying to imitate the prince, now lifted the hat from his bald head and crossed himself 3 times. "If there's anything, come back, Yakov Alpátych! For Christ's sake, think of us!" cried his wife, referring to the rumors of war and the enemy. Women's fuss," muttered Alpátych himself, and started on his journey, looking round at the fields of yellow rye and the still green, thickly growing oats, and at other quite black fields just being plowed a second time. As he went along, he looked with pleasure at the year's splendid crop of corn, scrutinized the strips of rye-field which here and there were already being reaped, made his calculations as to the sowing and the harvest, and asked himself whether he had not gotten any of the prince's orders. Having baited the horses twice on the way, he arrived at the town towards evening on the 4th of August. Alpátych kept meeting and overtaking baggage trains and troops on the road. As he approached Smolensk, he heard the sounds of distant firing, but these did not impress him. What struck him most was the sight of a splendid field of oats in which a camp had been pitched, and which was being mown down by the soldiers, evidently for fodder. This fact impressed Alpátych, but in thinking about his own business he soon forgot it. All the interests of his life for more than 30 years had been bounded by the will of the prince, and he never went beyond that limit. Everything not connected with the execution of the prince's orders did not interest and did not even exist for Alpátych. On reaching Smolensk on the evening of the 4th of August, he put up in the Gatchina suburb across the Dnieper, at the inn kept by Ferapóntov, where he had been in the habit of putting up for the last 30 years. Some 30 years ago, Ferapóntov, by Alpátych's advice, had bought a wood from the prince, had begun to trade, and now had a house, an inn, and a corn dealer's shop in that province. He was a stout, dark, red-faced peasant in the 40s, with thick lips, broad knob of a nose, similar knobs over his black frowning brows, and a round belly. Wearing a waistcoat over his cotton shirt, Ferapóntov was standing before his shop, which opened onto the street. On seeing Alpátych, he went up to him. "You're welcome, Yakov Alpátych. Folks are leaving the town, but you have come to it," said he. "Why are they leaving the town?" asked Alpátych. "That's what I say. Folks are foolish, always afraid of the French." Women's fuss, said Alpátych. "Just what I think, Yakov Alpátych. What I say is, orders have been given not to let them in, so that must be right, and the peasants are asking 3 rubles for carting isn't Christian." Yakov Alpátych heard without hearing. He asked for a samovar and for hay for his horses, and when he had had his tea he went to bed. All night long troops were moving past the inn. Next morning Alpátych donned a jacket he wore only in town and went out on business. It was a sunny morning, and by 8 o'clock it was already hot. A good day for harvesting, thought Alpátych. From beyond the town firing had been heard since early morning. At 8 o'clock the booming of cannon was added to the sound of musketry. Many people were hurrying through the streets, and there were many soldiers, but cabs were still driving about, tradesmen stood at the shops, and service was being held in the churches as usual. Alpátych went to the shops, to government offices, to the post office, and to the governor's. In the offices and shops and the post office everyone was talking about the army and about the enemy who was already attacking the town. Everybody was asking what should be done, and all were trying to calm one another. In front of the governor's house Alpátych found a large number of people, Cossacks and a traveling carriage of the governor's. At the porch he met 2 of the landed gentry, one of whom he knew. This man, an ex-captain of police, was saying angrily, "It's no joke, you know. It's all very well if you're single. One man though undone is but one, as the proverb says, but with 15 in your family and all the property, they've brought us to utter ruin. What sort of governors are they to do that? They ought to be hanged, the brigands." "Oh, come, that's enough," said the other. "What do I care? Let him hear. We're not dogs," said the ex-captain of police, and looking around he noticed Alpátych. "Oh, Yakov Alpátych, what have you come for?" "To see the governor by his Excellency's order," answered Alpátych, lifting his head and proudly thrusting his hand into the bosom of his coat, as he always did when he mentioned the prince. "He has ordered me to inquire into the position of affairs," he added. "Yes, go and find out," shouted the angry gentleman. "They've brought things to such a pass that there are no carts or anything. There it is again, you hear?" said he, pointing in the direction whence came the sounds of firing. "They've brought us all to ruin, the brigands," he repeated, and descended the porch steps. Alpátych swayed his head and went upstairs. In the waiting room were tradesmen, women, and officials, looking silently at one another. The door of the governor's room opened, and they all rose and moved forward. An official ran out, said some words to a merchant, called a stout official with a cross hanging on his neck to follow him, and vanished again, evidently wishing to avoid the inquiring looks and questions addressed to him. Alpátych moved forward, and next time the official came out addressed him, one hand placed in the breast of his button-coat, and handed him 2 letters. To his honor, Baron Ash, from General-in-Chief Prince Bolkonsky, he announced with such solemnity and significance that the official turned to him and took the letters. A few minutes later the governor received Alpátych and hurriedly said to him, "Inform the prince and princess that I knew nothing. I acted on the highest instructions here," and he handed a paper to Alpátych. "Still, as the prince is unwell, my advice is that they should go to Moscow. I'm just starting myself. Inform them." But the governor did not finish. Thus the perspiring officer ran into the room and began to say something in French. The governor's face expressed terror. "Go," he said, nodding his head to Alpátych, and began questioning the officer. Eager, frightened, helpless glances were turned on Alpátych when he came out of the governor's room. Involuntarily listening now to the firing, which had drawn nearer and was increasing in strength, Alpátych hurried to his inn. The paper handed him by the governor said this: "I assure you that the town of Smolensk is not in the slightest danger as yet, and it is unlikely that it will be threatened with any. I from the one side and Prince Bagration from the other are marching to unite our forces before Smolensk, which junction will be effected on the 22nd instant, and both armies with their united forces will defend our compatriots of the province and entrust it to your care till our efforts shall have beaten back the enemies of our fatherland, or till the last warrior in our valiant ranks has perished. From this you will see that you have a perfect right to reassure the inhabitants of Smolensk, for those defended by 2 such brave armies may feel assured on victory." (Instructions from Barclay de Tolly to Baron Ash, the civil governor of Smolensk, 1812). People were anxiously roaming about the streets. Carts piled high with household utensils, chairs, and cupboards kept emerging from the gates of the yards and moving along the streets. Loaded carts stood at the house next to Ferapóntov's, and women were wailing and lamenting as they said goodbye. A small watchdog ran round barking in front of the harnessed horses. Alpátych entered the inn-yard at a quicker pace than usual and went straight to the shed where his horses and trap were. The coachman was asleep. He woke him up, told him to harness, and went into the passage. From the host's room came the sounds of a child crying, the despairing sobs of a woman, and the hoarse, angry shouting of Ferapóntov. The cook began running hither and thither in the passage like a frightened hen, just as Alpátych entered. "He's done her to death, killed the mistress, beat her, dragged her about so." "What for?" asked Alpátych. "She kept begging to go away. She's a woman. 'Take me away,' says she. 'Don't let me perish with my little children. Folks,' she says, 'are all gone. So why,' she says, 'don't we go?' And he began beating and pulling her about so." At these words Alpátych nodded as if in approval, and, not wishing to hear more, went to the door of the room opposite the innkeeper's, where he had left his purchases. "You brute! You murderer!" screamed a thin, pale woman, who, with a baby in her arms and her kerchief torn from her head, burst through the door at that moment and down the steps into the yard. Ferapóntov came out after her, but on seeing Alpátych adjusted his waistcoat, smoothed his hair, yawned, and followed Alpátych into the opposite room. "Going already?" said he. Alpátych, without answering or looking at his host, sorted his packages and asked how much he owed. "We'll reckon up." "Well, have you been to the governor's?" asked Ferapóntov. "What has been decided?" Alpátych replied that the governor had not told him anything definite. "With our business, how can we get away?" said Ferapóntov. "We'd have to pay 7 rubles a cartload to Dorogobúzh, and I tell them they're not Christians to ask it. Selivanov now did a good stroke last Thursday, sold flour to the army at 9 rubles a sack. Will you have some tea?" he added. While the horses were being harnessed, Alpátych and Ferapóntov over the tea talked of the price of corn, the crops, and the good weather for harvesting. "Well, it seems to be getting quieter," remarked Ferapóntov, finishing his 3rd cup of tea and getting up. "Ours must have got the best of it. The orders were not to let them in, so we're in force, it seems. They say the other day Matthew Iványch Plátov drove them into the river Manor and drowned some 18,000 in one day." Alpátych collected his parcels, handed them to the coachman who had come in, and settled up with the innkeeper. The noise of wheels, hoofs, and bells was heard from the gateway as the little trap passed out. It was by now late in the afternoon. Half the street was in shadow, the other half brightly lit by the sun. Alpátych looked out of the window and went to the door. Suddenly the strange sound of a far-off whistling and thud was heard, followed by a boom of cannon, blending into a dull roar that set the windows rattling. He went out into the street. 2 men were running past towards the bridge. From different sides came whistling sounds and the thud of cannon balls and bursting shells falling on the town. But these sounds were hardly heard in comparison with the noise of the firing outside the town, and attracted little attention from the inhabitants. The town was being bombarded by 130 guns which Napoleon had ordered up after 4 o'clock. The people did not at once realize the meaning of this bombardment. At first the noise of the falling bombs and shells only aroused curiosity. Ferapóntov's wife, who till then had not ceased wailing under the shed, became quiet, and with the baby in her arms went to the gate, listening to the sounds and looking in silence at the people. The cook and a shop assistant came to the gate. With lively curiosity everyone tried to get a glimpse of the projectiles as they flew over their heads. Several people came round the corner talking eagerly. "What force!" remarked one. "Knocked the roof and ceiling all to splinters." "Routed up the earth like a pig," said another. "That's grand! It bucks one up," laughed the first. "Lucky you jumped aside or it would have wiped you out." Others joined those men and stopped and told how cannon balls had fallen on a house close to them. Meanwhile still more projectiles, now with the swift sinister whistle of a cannon ball, now with the agreeable intermittent whistle of a shell, flew over people's heads incessantly, but not one fell close by. They all flew over. Alpátych was getting into his trap. The innkeeper stood at the gate. "What are you staring at?" he shouted to the cook, who, in her red skirt, with sleeves rolled up, swinging her bare elbows, had stepped to the corner to listen to what was being said. "What marvels!" she exclaimed, but hearing her master's voice, she turned back, pulling down her tucked-up skirt. Once more something whistled, but this time quite close, swooping downwards like a little bird. A flame flashed in the middle of the street. Something exploded, and the street was shrouded in smoke. "Scoundrel! What are you doing?" shouted the innkeeper, rushing to the cook. At that moment the pitiful wailing of women was heard from different sides. The frightened baby began to cry, and people crowded silently with pale faces round the cook. The loudest sound in that crowd was her wailing. "Oh, dear souls! Dear kind souls, don't let me die, my good souls." 5 minutes later no one remained in the street. The cook, with her thigh broken by a shell splinter, had been carried into the kitchen. Alpátych, his coachman, Ferapóntov's wife and children, and the house porter were all sitting in the cellar, listening. The roar of guns, the whistling of projectiles, and the piteous moaning of the cook, which rose above the other sounds, did not cease for a moment. The mistress rocked and hushed her baby, and when anyone came into the cellar, asked in a pathetic whisper what had become of her husband who had remained in the street. A shopman who entered told her her husband had gone with others to the cathedral, whence they were fetching the wonder-working icon of Smolensk. Toward dusk the cannonade began to subside. Alpátych left the cellar and stopped in the doorway. The evening sky that had been so clear was clouded with smoke, through which, high up, the sickle of the new moon shone strangely. Now that the terrible din of the guns had ceased, a hush seemed to reign over the town, broken only by the rustle of footsteps, the moaning, the distant cries, and the crackle of fires, which seemed widespread everywhere. The cook's moans had now subsided. On two sides black curling clouds of smoke rose and spread from the fires. Through the streets soldiers in various uniforms walked or ran confusedly in different directions like ants from a ruined anthill. Several of them ran into Ferapóntov's yard before Alpátych's eye. Alpátych went out to the gate. A retreating regiment, thronging and hurrying, blocked the street. Noticing him, an officer said, "The town is being abandoned. Get away! Get away!" And then, turning to the soldiers, shouted, "I'll teach you to run into the yards." Alpátych went back to the house, called the coachman, and told him to set off. Ferapóntov's whole household came out too, following Alpátych and the coachman. The women, who had been silent till then, suddenly began to wail as they looked at the fires, the smoke, and even the flames of which could be seen in the falling twilight. And as if in reply to the same kind of lamentation was heard from other parts of the street. Inside the shed, Alpátych and the coachman arranged the tangled reins and traces of their horses with trembling hands. As Alpátych was driving out to the gate, he saw some 10 soldiers in Ferapóntov's open shop, talking loudly and filling their bags and knapsacks with flour and sunflower seeds. Just then Ferapóntov turned and entered his shop. On seeing the soldiers, he was about to shout at them, but suddenly stopped and, clutching at his hair, burst into sobs and laughter. "Loot everything, lads! Don't let those devils get it!" he cried, taking some bags of flour himself and throwing them into the street. Some of the soldiers were frightened and ran away. Others went on filling their bags. On seeing Alpátych, Ferapóntov turned to him. "Russia is done for," he cried. "Alpátych, I'll set the place on fire myself." "We're done for!" and Ferapóntov ran into the yard. Soldiers were passing in a constant stream along the street, blocking it completely, so that Alpátych could not pass out and had to wait. Ferapóntov's wife and children were also sitting in a cart waiting till it was possible to drive out. Night had come. There were stars in the sky, and the new moon shone out behind the smoke that screened it. On the sloping descent to the Dnieper, Alpátych's cart and that of the innkeeper's wife, which were slowly moving amid the rows of soldiers, and of other vehicles had to stop. In a side street near the crossroads where the vehicles had stopped, a house and some shops were on fire. This fire was already burning itself out. The flames now died down and were lost in the black smoke. Now suddenly flared up again, brightly, lighting up distinctness the faces of the people crowding at the crossroads. Black figures flitted about before the fire, and through the incessant cracking of the flames, talking and shouting could be heard. Seeing that his trap would not be able to move on for some time, Alpátych got down and turned into the side street to look at the fire. Soldiers were continually rushing backwards and forwards near it, and he saw two of them and a man in a frieze coat dragging burning beams into another yard across the street, while others carried bundles of hay. Alpátych went up to a large crowd standing before a high barn which was blazing briskly. The walls were all on fire and the black wall had fallen in. The wooden roof was collapsing and the rafters were alight. The crowd was evidently watching for the roof to fall in, and Alpátych watched for it too. "Alpátych!" a familiar voice suddenly hailed the old man. "Mercy on us, your Excellency!" answered Alpátych, immediately recognizing the voice of his young prince. Prince Andrew, in his riding cloak, mounted on a black horse, was looking at Alpátych from the back of the crowd. "Why are you here?" he asked. Your Excellency," stammered Alpátych, and broke into sobs. "Are we really lost, master?" "Why are you here?" Prince Andrew repeated. At that moment the flames flared up and showed his young master's pale, worn face. Alpátych told how he had been sent there and how difficult it was to get away. "Are we really quite lost, your Excellency?" he asked again. Prince Andrew, without replying, took out a notebook and, raising his knee, began writing in a pencil on a page he tore out. He wrote to his sister, "Smolensk is being abandoned. Bald Hill will be occupied by the enemy within a week. Set off immediately for Moscow. Let me know at once when you will start. Send by special messenger to Usvash." Having written this and given the paper to Alpátych, he told him how to arrange for departure of the prince, the princess, his son, and the boy's tutor, and how and where to let him know immediately. Before he had had time to finish giving these instructions, a chief of staff followed by a suite galloped up to him. "You are a colonel!" shouted the chief of staff with a German accent, in a voice familiar to Prince Andrew. "Houses are set on fire in your presence and you stand by. What does this mean?" "You will answer for it," shouted Berg, who was now assistant to the chief of staff of the commander of the left flank of the infantry of the First Army. A place, as Berg said, very agreeable and well on evidence. Prince Andrew looked at him and without replying went on speaking to Alpátych. "So tell them that I shall await a reply till the 10th, and if by the 10th I don't receive news that they have all got away, I shall have to throw up everything and come myself to Bald Hills." "Prince," said Berg, recognizing Prince Andrew, "I only spoke because I have to obey orders, because I always do obey exactly. You must please excuse me," he went on apologetically. Something cracked in the flames. The fire died down for a moment and wreaths of black smoke rolled from under the roof. There was another terrible crash and something huge collapsed. "Oh, roll, roll!" yelled the crowd, echoing the collapsing roof of the barn, the burning grain in which diffused a cake-like aroma all around. The flames flared up again, lighting the animated, delighted, exhausted faces of the spectators. The man in the frieze coat raised his arms and shouted, "It's fine, lads! Now it's raging! It's fine!" "That's the owner himself!" cried several voices. "Well then," continued Prince Andrew to Alpátych, "report to them as I have told you," and not replying a word to Berg, who was now mute beside him, he touched his horse and rode down the side street. End of Chapter 4. War and Peace, Book 10, Chapter 2. Read for LibriVox.org by Andy Yu, Mississauga, Canada.